Welcome, everyone. My name is Eva Leinola. I'm from the OECD Secretariat, and welcome to today's webinar on PFAS substances, where we'll be hearing updates on risk management approaches on PFAS activities from Canada, the EU, Israel, and Japan. So I thank all of them for joining the webinar today to give their updates. So just a little bit about the Global PFAS Group, under which this seminar is developed. So this group was established around 10 years ago now, a little bit more than 10 years ago, to support a transition towards safer alternatives to PFAS. So we've done different work under the group, including development of technical information on PFAS and alternatives, and publishing that work to help inform risk management activities, but also supporting exchange of information on risk management approaches across countries. So today I'm pleased to welcome from Japan, Takahiro Hasegawa from the Ministry of the Environment in Japan. And then we'll have a presentation by Daniel Sharon from Israel on the activities in Israel regarding PFAS. Then an update from the European Commission, both Martin Beekman and Valentina Barato from DG Grow and DG Environment. Then we'll hear from Canada, both Environment and Climate Change Canada. So Nabila Taha from Environment and Climate Change Canada, followed by Nora Dor McEwen from Health Canada. So each of them will be giving about a 20-minute update on their activities. So I encourage you during the presentations to enter any questions that you might have for the speakers and their updates on their activities in using the Q&A function of the Zoom. So you'll find that typically on the bottom of your screen where you can type in your question, and we'll address those questions after the speakers. So also to let you know in advance that the recording of the webinar will be made available on our website following the webinar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker. So to Takahiro Hasegawa from the Ministry of the Environment in Japan.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Can you hear me, and also can you see my presentations?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Tokyo. It's 8:05 p.m. here in Tokyo. First of all, thank you. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to present to you on the progress and the challenges in response to PFAS in Japan. My name is Takahiro Hasegawa, and I'm now Director for Chemical Evaluation Office at the Japanese Ministry of the Environment. I used to work with Eva and OECD colleagues 10 years ago in Paris, but now I moved back to Tokyo. So let's go to, okay. So my today's presentation is to provide an overview of the current situation of PFAS and to highlight some of the key actions that are being taken to mitigate their impact on human health and the environment in Japan. So let me start with some monitoring results across Japan. 4 years ago, we set PFOS and P4 as a substance to be monitored. And then local government started to monitor them. And the number of monitoring cases has increased significantly. The results show that out of 2,735 sites, 250 sites exceeded the provisional target of values of 50 nanogram per liter on PFAS and PFOS and PFOA in public water and groundwater. So this is not, it's around 10% of those who monitored. And so this is a public water and groundwater. And this also increased the concerns to drinking water. So that's why our ministry started a national surveys on PFAS in drinking water this summer. We recently conducted a national survey and to all suppliers around Japan. If they have tested for PFOA and PFOS or PFOA in their drinking water, and if they have tested and they found the concentration of those chemicals. We started the survey in late May, and we released the result in the end of November, so a few weeks ago. So according to the survey of drinking water, between 2020 and 2024, more than 2,000 suppliers, water suppliers, which covers 90% of total Japanese populations, tested PFOS and PFOA. And in 2020, there were 11 suppliers that exceeded the provisional target value, which is 50 nanogram per liter in their drinking water. However, the number steadily decreased each year and then reached to 0 in 2024, this year. And the provisional target value of 50 nanogram per liter has already been met by all 14 suppliers that previously exceeded the provisional target value before. So this is a brief overview of our national survey. But shortly after our release of the result, Japanese national NHK, which is a Japanese public broadcaster, put the result on their website. So maybe it's better to share their website instead of my presentations. So let me share my website here. Okay. I think now you can see website of NHK. So if you see a Japanese map, you can see a very colorful Japanese map of Japan. So red, you can see some red point, which is above the standard, and yellow is below the standard, but they have detected some PFOS or PFOA. And blue is not detected. So the color coding reflects the maximum value among those detected for each year. So the good news is that, as I mentioned earlier, by 2024, all the suppliers, drinking water suppliers, would have met the target. So there should be no red on the map as of 2024, as of this time. The challenge is, however, that as the result shows, these chemicals can be found anywhere around Japan, not only the central cities, not only for the rural area, but across Japan, because PFOS and PFOA have been used for more than 60 years across Japan. And now move back to my presentations. I think this is it. Moment, and let me share my, sorry, come back to my, okay. Now you can see my, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let's move to some framework for managing PFAS in Japan. So a brief overview of my regulations, of our regulations. In response to a Stockholm Convention, Japan regulated 3 PFASs, PFOS, PFOA, and PFHXS. So those are already prohibited on manufacturing and import in principle under our domestic law. PFOS and P4 was designated as the monitoring substances with a provisional target value, which is 15 nanogram per liter for PFOS and P4 combined for drinking water, public water, and groundwater 3 or 4 years ago. Let me give you some additional information about drinking water standard. We have 3 categories or tiers for managing substances in drinking waters. The first one, which is a red area, is water quality, drinking water quality standard. So water suppliers are obliged to meet standards for substance in this category. And also testing is mandatory. The yellow area is a set of substances for which water suppliers are encouraged to test for water quality management. Testing is not mandatory. And now PFOS, P4 are currently in this category, yellow category. And finally, we have a categories called substances for considerations for drinking water quality target. The government collects information in these categories for further considerations. This pyramid will come up again later. Let's move on to a series of actions we are currently taking in response to PFAS. Actually, there are a number of parallel activities and initiatives underway, which I believe can be broadly grouped into 4 categories. The first one is green area, it's preventing new release into the environment. And the second category is stopping the spread of population spread of pollutions. The third category is preventing health effect, and also the bottom one is risk communications. And there are some activities, but while this is not a comprehensive collection of all activities by our government, but it does cover most of our flagship activities. I will go into more detail on some of them in this presentation. And it is also important to mention that the chemical flows from 1 to 3, but this does not mean that we have to focus mainly on green area, number 1, because in reality, chemicals, PFAS are already released into the environment in the past. So all actions need to be promoted at the same time. This is a big challenge. The first flagship activity is about the preventing new release into the environment. So as I said, at present, the manufacture and import of new chemicals is banned, prohibited. But products containing PFOS and P4 that were manufactured in the past, and mainly this is aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, still exist in various facilities. Every 4 years, the government compile an inventories of AFFF containing PFOS, P4 as part of the national implementation plans under the Stockholm Convention. So this table shows the result of the most recent survey result in early November this year. So compared to the last survey 4 years ago, the total volume of AFFF decreased by 45%, and the PFOS decreased by 36%, which is good. And in fact, the priorities has been given to sites with potential environmental risk is high due to the frequency and volume of use. So this result implies that the risk has been significantly reduced over past 4 years. And we will continue to address small parking lots and other sites, which is the bottom of this table. We will continue to target small car parking areas and for substitution, because there are there have a lot of PFOS containing AFFF in their sites. As I mentioned, we have a target value 15 nanogram per liter for combined PFOS and PFOA for drinking water. So to reduce the risks associated with those chemicals through the consumption of drinking water, now we are discussing whether to upgrade the categories from yellow area to red area, drinking water quality standard. So if it is upgraded to the red area, water suppliers will be required to meet the standard and also test the chemicals as a mandatory substances. At the same time, regardless of how the standard is categorized, I mean red or yellow, we want to ensure 100% compliance with the target for drinking waters, including those who have not currently who have not tested for quality check. To this end, financial support for public water supplier is being considered by the government. Let me share some progress about a scientific research supported by the government. We have a series of many studies and researches that can be scientifically evaluated. The first one is a comprehensive study on PFAS. So those research aims to reveal the adverse effect of PFAS and quantitative method for determining hazard to identify the substances with the highest need of risk management among many types of PFAS. We also have competitive research funding systems called ERTDF and various researches to support environmental policy is conducting. And this includes a perspective cohort studies to uncover the relationship between PFAS broad level and health impact. And we also have children's studies, National Survey on Children's Health and the Environment. We call it Eco Children Studies. And this includes around 100,000 pairs of parents and children to identify the relationship between environmental factors and children's health. And we included PFAS as a substance to be identified. And also, I'd like to touch upon some ongoing efforts for communication to communicate risk effectively to the public. On your left, you can see a small one-page leaflet we published this summer. This provides key information on P4 PFAS and is distributed at local government office. We also have a dedicated website to provide all relevant information on PFAS. So as summary, unfortunately, PFOS and P4 have been detected around the world throughout Japan. So public concerns about water safety and health is growing. So to address these situations, we have taken various actions, measures. What I have presented today are some of the key initiatives. So to prevent new release into the environment, we strengthen management of products containing PFOS and promote measures for substitutions. As regard to drinking water, we will deliberate if the provisional target value for drinking water would be upgraded to mandated one to reduce health risks on the consumption of drinking water. As there is insufficient scientific knowledge on the health effect, we will promote scientific research and studies, and also strengthen risk communication so that people can understand PFOS scientific knowledge. We are, of course, committed to fully implementing these measures and initiatives to protect human health and environment. So this is the end of my presentations, and thank you again for these opportunities. And I would be happy if you notice my, how can I say, a vertical reading, hidden message in my presentations. Thank you very much, and back to Eva.
Great. Thank you, Taka. Yes, we see your PFAS in your contents of your presentation. Thank you very much for the overview of the activities in Japan. There's several questions that have come in, and we'll take some of those after the other speakers, but maybe I can just pose one to you right now. So there was a few questions about the target value of 50 nanograms per liter. So some questions were around what that covers, and I understand that is PFOA and PFAS, those two PFASs. But then there was also the question of how that value was established, the 50 nanograms per liter. So if you can say something about that.
Yes, this is a combination of P4 and P4 and P4s. This comes from TDI evaluations, and then we have I cannot remember correctly, but this was calculated from the TDI,
Tolerable daily intake. Yeah.
Intake, yeah. And assuming that our body weight is, I think, 50 kilogram, and then we calculate these numbers. Mm-hmm. I know some countries, some country has a more tightened numbers, and some are not. But for the time being, we have this number.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'll come back to you with a couple of questions after the other speakers. So
sure, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so next we'll move to the presentation from Israel. So welcome Daniel Sharon from the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Israel, who will give us an update of some of the activities underway on risk management of PFAS. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. We'll share. See the presentation?
Yes. If you can just put it in the
yes.
Presentation mode.
Well, hi everybody. I'm Daniel Sharon. I work at the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Israel. I'm the Director of Integrated Industrial Licensing Division, and I will give you a short interview of the PFAS risk management activities from Israel. So we start with the sources for the PFAS to the environment. It's the industry. In Israel, we have about 220 factories that use about 1,000 tons of PFAS compounds in the production processes, and we have about 60 big facilities that hold about 2,000 tons of PFAS from AFFF, firefighting foams. And when we check the industrial wastewater of those factories and facilities, 85 of the wastewater that we sampled contained, we found PFAS in them. And in Israel, most of the industrial wastewater is going to the municipal wastewater treatment plant. And we use the effluent from those wastewater treatment plants for agricultural irrigation. And we checked the effluents going for irrigation, and we found that 60% of the samples contained from the municipal wastewater treatment plant contains PFAS. And also the sludge after treatment, it goes for agricultural uses in Israel. And in 85% of the sludges from those wastewater treatment plants, we found PFAS. As well as the minority of those industries is going to the sea or the river, and we found also in their effluent PFAS as well. So on the other end, also in the leachate of landfills, we found PFAS. And surprising or not, we found it also in our groundwater. And in Israel, the situation is so severe that in 21% of the groundwater that was monitoring during the period time of 2020 and during 3 years of a survey, we found PFAS. And 6 wells were closed due to the exceedance from the threshold value of PFAS, quite immediately. And in 2026, we're going to adapt the European threshold for PFAS in drinking water, and we are accepting it will cause to us to close another 10 additional wells. And also in our, we don't have much rivers in Israel. It's more like a short stream and seasonal streams. But also in the streams, we found PFAS compounds. Here we have a map that shows where we found in the PFAS in the groundwater. In orange and red is where we found PFAS above the detection level, and in red it is above the current drinking water threshold. And if you see that all the places that we found a high concentration of PFAS are near energy infrastructures and fire authority training school and military bases and airports. So there is, it's lead us for the insight that the AFFF is the major source for contamination of groundwater in Israel. Here we can see zoom in for one of the hotspots in near Haifa, and we can see that in the red spot the concentration of PFOS 908, and 29.6 is microgram per liter is for PFOA. And this is the source of a fuel farm. And here is one of the drinking water wells that we were that we closed because of this contamination of PFAS. So the existing standard is based on the Canadian standard, and it's for the PFOS 0.6 and PFOA 0.2. And in 2026, we're going to base our drinking water standard as well as the European standards as some of PFAS 20 compounds as 0.1 microgram per liter. So we have noticed that the industry is the main source for the PFAS in the environment. So we made an action plan that follows the steps of first we do the literature survey plus regulation survey. So this we learned about the compound structure, the chemical and physical properties, and sources of their distribution in the environment. It's done, but it's, as you probably know, it's require updating because all the time we found out new information about that compound and etc. We next we did the mapping of the regulatory gaps and studying an examination and of the regulatory gaps, and in parallel we done a PFAS source survey. We start with mapping the potential sources in the industry. We've done some sampling of industrial wastewater, the wastewater treatment plant, landfills, and streams. And we report that these samples is published, and we can share it if you want to see. And also we are doing a soil investigation, mostly where we have sites with fires or places where we know the groundwater is contaminated with PFAS. And I will focus about the regulation updates that we were taking during this action plan. It's about obligation to submit information about PFAS compounds, and we are still working about setting up threshold values in wastewater that goes for the municipal wastewater treatment plant, and for the soil and the sludge for discharge or transfer or rehabilitation. Sorry, it's okay. And guidelines for sampling and analysis, it's already done, and conditions in permits for prevention, reduction, and treatment of PFAS compounds, it's done as well, and this is what I will show you. So the potential industrial sources for PFAS in Israel. We see that we have no chemical factories that have PFAS production in Israel. So all the PFAS is coming from abroad. And some industrial sectors as textiles, surface treatment for metals, we have about 60 in Israel. Wire production, we have few, and production of surfactant, plastics, and we have tens, and print, and semiconductors, PCBs, we have about 10. These are the sectors that we found in Israel that are using PFAS compounds in the process. As well, some of them or others are what I named here is AFFF facilities. We have this is for the firefighting and for the training and the maintenance of the equipment. We have about 60 big ones, not including the army, and around 500 small and medium ones that contain a small amount of AFFF. And then in the end, it all goes to the wastewater treatment plants. We have about 90 large wastewater treatment plants. Most of the effluent is go for irrigation, as I said, and the sludge is also go as for agricultural use. And landfills in Israel, we have 14 active one and 15 not active, and some of the not active one are not a good situation that don't have a liner, let's say, under the waste, as the standard may say. So in the action plan was started in May 2021, and it took us some years, 2 years, to learn and to make the survey and to create a draft for the interested parties comment. And then we had a discussion with them, It was mostly from the petroleum sector, but as well as from PCBs and other industrial sectors that where we have a long discussions with them. Then we publish it for the public comments, and at October 24, we published the final document, and we start implementation in permits. So what are the terms that are going to have? The first one is they need to have a submission of information on PFAS compounds in the business within 2 months. They need to must be based on the SDS, and if the SDS or the manufacturer information mention compounds but lack specific details, so they need to have a sampling. If you see here, for example, the SDS says that here they have a fluorosurfactant, but they don't say the concentration and don't say which PFAS compounds are in. So we tell them to do analysis, and then we found out what are the PFAS compounds in this specific material. Of course, the testing standard must be using the standard methods in a certificate, the laboratory. The second term is replacing or reducing the use of PFAS. They need to do within 1 year a techno-economic examination and to submit a plan for the substance of which an alternative was found in the examination. And for firefighting foams containing PFAS compounds, when we say PFAS compound, it's not only the P4 and PFOS, it's all the 5 or 4,700 different PFAS compounds. So if they are above 1 milligram per liter, they need to have, they can use it only for a class B fire, for flammable liquids only within 6 months, not for, let's say, class A. And for testing, they need to, within 18 months, they need to stop testing using PFAS, AFFF foams that have PFAS in them. Well, and we have exception here, unless the system design and operational standards require PFAS containing foams for the testing. And for training, so within 2 months, they have to conduct a training on operating surface and clean the surface, collect the washings and disposing of them as hazardous waste containing PFAS compounds. And within 18 months, they need to stop using PFAS containing foams for training purposes. The next term is for a PFAS emission management plan. Within 18 months, need to have to map the source for at least 90% of PFAS emission or transfers in the business before treatment. So let's say you have a big PCB installation, and there are many sub-partial streams of wastewater. So they need to go through all those partial streams to build up a knowledge and mapping of 90% of those partial streams that are responsible for the 90% of the PFAS emissions. to know where it's coming from. And then after doing so, they need to establish a treatment methods for each stream using the best available technique and set application dates for those plans. Visual inspection and waste collection. For the visual inspection, they need to do it at least once a month to examine all the equipment and facilities that contain PFAS, and a collection of firefighting water containing PFAS. So if it's coming from during the maintenance and operations, so you need to ensure that proper storage, collection, treatment, and disposal of liquids and solid waste from PFAS containing firefighting foams, including from training and or testing. And if you have a firefighting event, so you need to pump and evacuate the foam to a designated container within 14 days after the event. And if it's from cleaning or testing, so you need to do it within 6 hours after or the testing. The next is you need to update some of the procedures for handling PFAS. So this is the first one is to specify the process set in container and equipment PFAS.
We seem to have lost Daniel for the moment. Let's just see if he comes back in the next moment or two. Here he is. He's returning.
Sorry, I'm back again.
Okay, great. Yeah, we hear you now
I
again.
don't know when I lose you.
It was about just 10 seconds ago, 10, 15 seconds.
Okay. And can I share? I cannot share.
Oh, okay. Bala will re-give you the sharing rights, probably because it logged off.
Sorry for this.
Okay. Bala, if you can confirm when Daniel can share his presentation.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm back.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so this is the procedure update and including immediate response measure. And equipment replacement and cleaning. So then need to clean. Next is the classification of hazardous waste containing PFAS. So we established a new definition for hazardous waste containing PFAS. It's when they have the concentration of PFAS compounds that exceeds 1 milligram per kilogram. Which include the foams, of course, water and solids, and etc. Doing so, we need to update our guidelines for the classification of hazardous waste, and we also want terms is about the prevention of mixing hazardous waste containing PFAS, so they need to be stored in a manner that prevent mixing with other waste. And the containers that contain over one PFAS, let's say, They need to be labeled, marked with a label that waste container containing PFAS compounds for disposal, and they need to be disposed in a proper manner. They cannot be reused, okay, those containers. And last but not the least, the sampling and monitoring of PFAS is the industrial wastewater sampling need to be done every 3 months. And if you only use the firefighting foam, so you need to sample every 6 months. Of course, the sample need to be by a certified sampler, and the testing should be by a certified laboratory. And thank you for your attention. That's it.
Great, thank you, Daniel, for the very interesting presentation. Also outlining a number of different activities, from the monitoring to new submission requirements of information for industry to different emission management plans. And so it's quite a number of different activities. Maybe at this point, there are several questions, so we can come back to those later. But maybe I can just ask you one that a couple of people raised. You mentioned it a little bit in your presentation, but so when you speak about PFAS, what is the definition that Israel is using? Because each country tends to use a little bit of a different definition.
We use the definition that is right now in the that was said that every as well as in the how do you say it? In the REACH, when they propose to have restrictions for all kinds of PFAS. So this is pretty much the definition that we took in Israel. Mm-hmm. But when we regulate and we talk, let's say, for hazardous waste, when you need to do the classification. So we talked about around 40 measurable PFAS compounds. So the definition is what is PFAS? It's quite big, but for the regulation, you talk about what you can measure. So this is only about 40 compounds right now.
Okay, great. Okay, that's all very interesting information, and we'll come back to some questions after the other two presentations. Thank you. So let's move now to the presentation from the EU. So I think first we'll have Martin Beekman starting us off from DG Grow, and that will be followed by Valentina Bertato from DG Environment. So Martin, over to you.
Yes, thank you, and good morning or evening or afternoon to everybody. Indeed, it will be a co-presentation from the European Commission. So I will first talk about the actions we are taking in Europe for the placing on the market and use of PFAS, and then Valentina will continue with some other environmental legislation. Next slide, please. Yeah, so on this slide, you see a list of PFAS which are already restricted in Europe, and some, of course, also globally, following the Stockholm Convention. You can find more details on these restricted substances on the webpage from the OECD, for example. And I think we mentioned them before in previous meetings, so I will not go to further details. Only the last bullet is new, because in September of this year, we adopted a restriction on PFAS, so the perfluorohexanoic acid, and it's covered in REACH Annex 17. Next slide. So what did we do? We restrict the placing on the market and use of this substance, its salts and related substances for some specific uses. And you can see on the slide, we restrict them for clothing and other textiles for the general public, for food contact materials made from paper and cardboard, for consumer mixtures, for cosmetic products, and for some uses in firefighting foams, especially that for training testing, by public fire service, and for civil aviation. So as said, we adopted this restriction in September of this year. So it's entered into force after 20 days after publication, but there are some transitional periods before the restriction will be applicable to the sectors, and those transitional periods range between 18 months and 5 years. So the first ones are for the training and the testing, for the firefighting foams, and followed by others. But the details, of course, here can be found in the legislation, but that's more or less what we restrict on PFAS. You can see it's really targeted to specific users. This was on purpose. There will be a new restriction coming, and I will talk to you about this a bit later. And then some of the uses of PFAS, so this substance, will be rediscussed. These are more in the field of the industrial uses or other applications. But based on the information we had so far, it was not sufficient to decide on the restriction. So therefore, we chose to go for the ones we are for sure that they're causing a risk, but also alternatives are available and the economic impact would be proportionate of the restriction. So we can move to the next slides. So the next one is on PFAS and firefighting foams. So when we go back some years, the Commission asked ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, to prepare a so-called Annex 15 restriction dossier. So they did, and the scientific committees of ECHA, the RAC and the SEAC, have finalized their opinions about 1 year ago, 1.5 years ago, and they proposed to restrict the placing on the market, formulation and use of PFAS as a group, according to the OECD 2021 definition, in firefighting foams. They propose several transitional periods, but also to have additional risk reduction measures. And at the right side of the slide, there is some information about the emissions of PFAS due to the different applications of firefighting foams. Based on the opinions we received, the Commission prepared its proposal, and it was published about 3 weeks ago. And you can find that on the comitology register, where all the proposals are published. And on the next slide, I have some details. So what did we propose? And be mindful, it's a proposal from the Commission. We still need to discuss this with the member states, and we will have to vote, and it's going to Parliament and the Council for scrutiny. So it's not there yet. And so it's really a draft at the moment. And we will start the discussions actually next week with the member states. But we propose to have a restriction of placing on the market and use of PFAS and firefighting foams after 5 years. This is more the general period, transitional period for the use of PFAS and firefighting foams. But for some applications, we propose a quicker transition because we think there it is possible to move out from the PFAS earlier, and for other ones, we have a longer transitional period, and they are mentioned on the slides. So again, for the training and testing, public fire services after 18 months, for the portable fire extinguishers, so the ones you all have in your offices, if they apply PFAS, of course, for these portable fire extinguishers, it's for the placing on the market 12 months. So after 12 months, it should not be placed on the market anymore. And for the alcohol-resistant firefighting foams, it's a bit longer. And the use, it's taking a bit more time to replace all the existing fire extinguishers from the offices, from all the buildings. So there we have a period till the end of 2030. For surface sites, so industrial sites, offshore oil and gas industry, for ships already in service, and for military ships, we propose a 10 years derogation. You can see that mainly, especially this last bullet, it is a quite long transitional period. And therefore, we also propose to have obligatory risk management measures after 12 months after the restriction is adopted. And because during these 10 years transitional periods, the foams still can be used, and we have to minimize emissions to the environment from those firefighting foams. So there is the risk management measures, and I think, well, they are a bit similar to the ones just explained from the regulation in Israel. So you prevent the emissions by collecting the use foams, by treat the waste properly, etc., etc. Also, risk management plan has to be made by the operator. So these ones are to guarantee that we try to avoid exposure to the environment of those PFAS. But as I said, we will start the discussions now, and I hope we will be able to proceed quite quickly on this one, and then have an adoption maybe end of next year. Moving to the next slide. Then we have in Europe the universal PFAS restriction, and that one is still in the assessment phase. So it was submitted by 5 national authorities: Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And they submitted their proposal and the dossier to the European Chemicals Agency, and the scientific committees are now preparing their opinion, having good discussions, also having public consultation. So we had the first public consultation last year, and it retrieved many comments. So over 5,600 comments were received, and it takes some time to take all those comments into account and to come to this opinion. But of course, we have to do that carefully. Also, this restriction covering all PFAS according to the OECD definition, and it's covering all use of PFAS except for the firefighting foams, because it's already been dealt with the previous restriction. But they also, for example, the dossier submitters propose to derogate, give a time unlimited derogation for active ingredients of PFAS in biocidal products, plant protection products, and medicinal products. But in principle, the dossier covers all those uses. So it's a lot, many uses of PFAS. And for practical reasons, the discussion in the scientific committees is done in batches, because it's just simply too much to discuss it in one go. So we are discussing, the committees are discussing sector by sector. You can go to the next slide. So as you can see, what did we do so far, or the committees mainly? They discussed the use of PFAS in consumer mixtures, cosmetics, and ski wax. They also discussed metal plating, manufacturing of metal products. Then they discussed the textiles, upholstery, leather, apparel, and carpets. But to be aware that the technical textiles are not discussed in this group, but they will be discussed later. Then we have food contact materials and packaging, petroleum and mining. And we, in December, or actually it was November, end of November, there was another discussion on the textiles and the food contact materials, and also on construction products. And also for the construction products, some were covered and other covered in other sectors, but they explained there. For all those sectors which are on the slide, RAC and SER came to tentative conclusions. But at the end of the process, when they have discussed all sectors, there will be a discussion on some horizontal issues which might influence the overall conclusion. So it's work ongoing. They're making progress. So they discuss quite some sectors, but also, of course, many other sectors has to come next year. And next slide. Interestingly, the file is taking quite some time. Normally, we have an opinion after bit more than 1 year, but this takes several years due to the large size of the file. And to provide as good as possible information to all stakeholders, there are several activities from ECHA mainly. They publish podcasts after each RAC and SEAC meeting where they present what they discussed. But also, and I think that's relevant for all of you, there was an update, a progress update made by the dossier submitters together with ECHA, and they published on the website of ECHA how they are treating, mainly all the comments received during the consultation, how, for example, they treat newly identified users, how they will cover horizontal issues, so they propose to have some specific sectors, across the sector, so the specific discussion across sectors. For example, ceilings are used in many sectors, PFAS ceilings, so they group them all together in one file. And they also mentioned in this communication that they will also consider other restriction options. So in the dossier, which they originally submitted, there were two restriction options. One was a ban after 18 months, and another one on a restriction after 18 months with derogations. But they also now announced that they will consider a third restriction option, meaning continued use with measures to minimize the emissions. But you can read the communication from the dossier submitters and ECHA on the website. And next slide. So what is the role of the Commission for this big file? We are observer at the moment, RACASER. It's the independent assessment by those committees, which will provide us the opinions. And based on those opinions, when we receive it, like we did for the previous dossier, we will prepare a proposal. And we can deviate from the proposal, but then we have to justify why we see a need to deviate. In the meantime, we are meeting stakeholders to hear their views and to hear their concerns. There is a lot of concern in Europe about this proposal, so it's good to familiarize ourselves with the concerns and with the discussions. And it's good to mention that it's submitted under the current REACH regulation, so it will also be assessed under this regulation. And there are three important elements. One is a risk, including emissions during life cycle. That's taken as a proxy for the risk, the emissions. The availability of alternatives is key, and the socioeconomic impact. So these three elements will come back in the assessments by the scientific committees. And then the next slide, and that's the final one for me, and then Valentina will take over. Well, of course, you probably have noticed that there is a new commission. It was just installed by the 1st of December, and we had some hearings in the parliament, some written questions, and the new commissioners also mentioned PFAS. So on PFAS, they stated that they would aim for a ban on the use of PFAS in consumer applications like cosmetics, food contact materials, and outdoor clothing. And they also mentioned that they would see a continued use of PFAS in industrial applications if there are no adequate alternatives available under strictly controlled conditions. It's, I would say, how the new commission would approach the PFAS file, but of course we need the input from the scientific committees to fill this in, because then we need the information on the alternatives, etc. So we cannot further specify this, but it's at least the direction we want to go as a commission. That's for me, and then I hand over to Valentina.
Thank you, Martin. I will indeed now take over and speak about other legislative actions in the EU, apart from restrictions under REACH and under the POPs regulation, because we have a full action plan on PFAS that considers the restriction as the main action to reduce the emissions at the source, but in the meanwhile, until the restrictions are in place and to deal with the existing contamination, we need to use all the other legislative tools that we have. So we have, for example, already set limits under the food contaminant regulation for some food commodities, and we are doing monitoring on the food commodities for which we do not have enough information. We have recently an update of the regulation on the fluorinated gases. Some of these gases are also PFAS, and there are some bans introduced there for refrigeration and air conditioning. But as I cannot speak in detail about all these legislation, I will now focus on the legislations that concern water and the Industrial Emission Directive. So next slide, please. So what is ongoing in the framework of water legislation? We have an amended drinking water directive that set already a few years ago limits for total PFAS, so all PFAS, and for a sum of 20 specific PFAS. And the member states, they must apply one or both parameters by January 2026. So the big question here was, how do we measure these PFAS in drinking water? And this is why the Commission was tasked to publish technical guidelines on the analytical methods, and this was done recently. So when you receive the presentation, you will find the link to the guidance. And there is a list of analytical methods available for PFAS total and for the sum of the 20 PFAS, which are recommended to be used. In addition to this, the Commission started work with the World Health Organization to do a review of the human health data, the impacts of PFAS on human health. And this is in order to see if there is a need to review the limits that have been set for drinking water, as in the meanwhile, we have seen quite a lot of advances in science. And we are also doing a study on the cost to remove PFAS from drinking water. As most of you very well know, the shorter the PFAS, the harder it is to remove it from drinking water. And then also, if it would be feasible to have an extended producer responsibility scheme to deal with PFAS in drinking water. And the idea is to see if it's possible to apply the polluter pays principle in this case, because of the very high cost to remediate PFAS contamination in drinking water. We are also working on the surface water and the groundwater, and we are reviewing the two main directives for surface water and groundwater. There is already a proposal by the Commission to add 24 PFAS to the list of priority substances, both for surface water and groundwater, and to have limits on this. This process has not been concluded yet, as this is a long, what we call a co-decision process, where the Commission makes a proposal, but then the Parliament and the Council need to discuss and agree on a final text. And this is still ongoing, also considering that we have now a new Parliament. So next slide, please. Now we move now to another piece of legislation, the Industrial Emission Directive. This is the European legislation that is controlling the emissions from large industrial installations. This was also reviewed not so long ago, and one important new element is that there is now in this directive much more attention to chemical pollution. For example, since this directive sets the rules then for the member states to set environmental permits for this industrial installation, now in the permit we have a requirement that it needs to set emission limit values for specific substances that are set in an annex. And as I will explain later on, this annex is under review, and we are considering to add some more PFAS to this annex. So this would lead to the environmental permits that are, for example, delivered to an installation using PFAS, that they set limits of emissions, which are currently not there. And then there are also new requirements to assess the need to prevent or reduce emissions of substances that are considered to be of high priority under the REACH chemical legislation. So we see here also more strengthening this link between the industrial emission and the chemical legislation. And these are the substances that are either in the authorization scheme, so the substances of very high concern, or substances that are restricted in Annex 17 to REACH. And in the future, once we have all these PFAS restrictions in Annex 17, this would apply also to PFAS. Then considering the best available technologies, because the Industrial Emission Directive is the framework legislation then to develop these very technical documents to describe how certain production should be made. Then also in this case, when these documents are developed, there will be more attention to the use of hazardous substances, also prescribing possibly substitution. Next slide, please. Another new element in the Industrial Emission Directive is that now there is a mandatory environmental management system that has the objective to improve continuously environmental performance and the safety of the installation. And also here we have a link on the chemical substances, saying that it shall include this environmental management system at least a chemical inventory of hazardous substances that are used or emitted in the installation and the possibility of substituting it. So looking again into preventing the emission and not only controlling. And this environmental management system needs to be prepared and then audited at national level by accredited auditors by the 1st of July of 2027. Next slide. So now we go to another piece of legislation that is linked to the Industrial Emission Directive, and it concerns a register that we have had in the EU for many years now on pollution release. Now this register is going to be replaced by the Industrial Emission Portal that is going to be developed. And here we already have two PFAS, PFOA and PFHXS and their salts. And they need to be monitored and reported starting in 2028. But the Commission can propose to add new substances to this annex. And these are the substances that later will need to be considered in the environmental permit with the setting of emission limits. And a study is now ongoing in the Commission to propose new PFAS to be added to the registry. So the direction towards which we are going is to have more and more PFAS whose releases would need to be reported in the registry. I think this might be then the last one. So next slide. Yes, it is. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to replying to any question.
Thank you, Valentina and Martin, for that overview of the number of different EU activities, focusing on the REACH activities, but also the water legislation and the Industrial Emissions Directive. Maybe before we go to Canada, I will just ask, there was one quite specific question for Martin when you were speaking about the firefighting foams, and you were talking about the different transition periods, and there was a question regarding what the transition period would be for non-Seveso industrial sites. So I think you mentioned Seveso industrial sites, but is that something you can answer?
Yeah, so in principle, the general transition period is 5 years. So if nothing is specifically mentioned, then the 5 years will be applied. In our proposal, of course. Still.
Right. Okay, great. And then there's a number of other questions also for the EU, and we'll come back to some of them. But let's go first to Canada's presentation. So from Canada, we have with us Nora Dorr-McEwen from Health Canada and Nabila Taha from Environment and Climate Change Canada. So over to you for your update on activities in Canada.
Yes, thanks very much, Eva, for inviting us to come and present to everyone on our risk management activities with regard to PFAS. So I'll start things off and then I'll hand it over to my colleague Nabila partway through the presentation to finish it. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll start with a bit of background in terms of our work on PFAS. So Canada has been working on a class approach to PFAS for a few years. In 2021, we published a notice of intent that stated that the government intended to move forward with activities to address the broad class. And this was because scientific evidence was increasingly showing that the PFAS used to replace those that were already restricted were also associated with human or environmental concerns. And so, we worked on that for a few years, and in 2023, we published a draft State of PFAS report and a risk management scope. And the draft State of PFAS report is essentially a draft risk assessment. Now, a risk management scope is a document that we typically publish under the Chemicals Management Plan whenever we have a risk assessment proposing that a substance or a group of substances are toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And what that is it's quite a high-level document that just shares some of our early thinking on potential risk management. And so both of these were published for a 60-day public comment period, which is standard for our Chemicals Management Plan. Then in 2024, so a little bit over a year later, we published an updated draft State of PFAS report and a revised risk management scope document. And these were also open for a 60-day public comment period. And at the same time as we published these, we published a summary of the comments we'd received on the original drafts and responses to those comments. So that can be found online on our website. Next slide, please. And so just to give you a few highlights of the updated draft State of PFAS report, the PFAS addressed in that report are based on this OECD definition that you can see on the slide here, and I won't read the whole thing out. The report provides a qualitative assessment of sources, fate, occurrence, and potential impacts of PFAS on the environment and on human health. And we did receive quite a large number of comments on the draft report, so over 350 sets of comments. And so the updated draft State of PFAS report was updated to reflect all those comments that we received, but also information from other sources. Next slide, please. So we did receive quite a significant number of comments on fluoropolymers. Now, fluoropolymers are defined in the updated draft State of PFAS report as polymers made by polymerization or copolymerization of olefinic monomers, at least one of which contains fluorine bonded to one or both of the olefinic carbon atoms to form a carbon-only polymer backbone with fluorine atoms directly bonded to it. And so our risk assessors have proposed that there's evidence to suggest that fluoropolymers may have significantly different exposure and hazard profiles compared to other PFAS. And so given this, what they've proposed is that additional work on fluoropolymers is needed, and PFAS meeting that definition of fluoropolymers are planned for consideration in a separate assessment. Now, a very important point on this is that carve out of fluoropolymers from the updated draft State of PFAS report is by no means meant to be a proposal that they're of no concern or of low concern. It is simply a proposal, again, that they may have different exposure and hazard profiles and that they need to be looked at separately. Next slide, please. And so what did we propose in our updated draft State of PFAS report? What are our proposed conclusions? Well, on the basis of what is known about well-studied PFAS and the potential for other PFAS to behave similarly, and also on the expectation that combined exposures to multiple PFAS increases the likelihood of detrimental impacts, the updated draft report proposes that the class of PFAS, excluding fluoropolymers, as defined in the report, are toxic under paragraphs 64A and 64C of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so 64A contains the criteria for toxicity to the environment. 64C is toxicity to human health. And so we've proposed that the class of PFAS, excluding fluoropolymers, meets both of these criteria. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we also published a revised risk management scope document with that updated draft State of PFAS report. And it contains a proposed risk management objective for the class excluding fluoropolymers, which is to, over time, achieve the lowest level of environmental and human exposure that are technically feasible, taking into consideration socioeconomic factors. The risk management scope also proposes some risk management options that are under consideration. So again, just early stage thinking at this point. And that proposal for risk management actions is through a phased approach. And it would start with, as a first step, due to their high potential for environmental and human exposure, a regulation under SEPA to restrict PFAS that aren't currently regulated in firefighting foams. And the reason it's framed that way is that we do have some subgroups of PFAS that are already regulated, and Nabila will speak to that a little bit later. And then as subsequent phases, additional regulations under SEPA to prohibit other uses or sectors in relation to PFAS are proposed. And in terms of those other uses or sectors, we would be proposing to prioritize for prohibition based on factors like socioeconomic considerations, the availability of feasible alternatives, and the potential for human and environmental exposure. And I will turn it over to Nabila to continue the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Nora. I'm Nabila Taha. I am Nora's counterpart at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we lead on the risk management of PFAS that are already assessed. And I'll get into that a little more detail as I go through the remainder of the slides. So I'm going to continue with the risk management portion of this presentation. So in addition to some of the risk management options that are under consideration that Nora just mentioned, the revised risk management scope notes a number of voluntary actions that are being considered to achieve early results to reduce PFAS releases. So this includes looking into opportunities to increase disclosure of information. So for example, through labeling, that would enable consumers and importers to identify products that contain PFAS. We've also been engaging with interested sectors on options for voluntarily phasing out PFAS. And we're working with our North American trading partners through the Commission for Environmental Cooperation on alternative assessments and informed substitution of PFAS. So in addition to the recent actions that were noted in the revised risk management scope, another action that was recently launched was a PFAS challenge, and that's by Innovation Science and Economic Development Canada, or ISED, under their Innovation Solutions Canada program. The focus of the challenge is on advancing the destruction of PFAS compounds in contaminated media, and we do have a link in the presentation to get more information on that. We're also considering enhanced stakeholder engagement through the launch of a PFAS roundtable, and this would help enable PFAS action as needed. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps for the updated draft of PFAS report and revised risk management scope, noted they were published for 60-day public comment period this past July. The comment period ended in September, and this information and the comments received are being considered in the development of the final state of PFAS report. Just like we did for the initial draft, a summary of public comments and responses will be published along with the final report. Next slide, please. Looking forward to some additional next steps. So should the proposed conclusion of the updated draft state of PFAS report be confirmed in the final report, a risk management approach document would also be published at the same time for a 60-day public comment period. So Nora noted the revised risk management scope, which sets some high-level thinking with risk management, and a proposed risk management approach will do the same. And this is consistent with risk assessment and risk management process under Canada's environmental plan. In addition, a proposed order to add the class of PFAS, excluding fluoropolymers, to Schedule 1, which is also known as the list of toxic substances to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, would be published for a 60-day public comment period. So I've noted 2 potential comment periods, and we would continue to consult with stakeholders in the development of risk management actions should that conclusion be confirmed in the final report. Next slide, please. So in terms of federal action underway, we do have and you may be familiar with Canada's prohibition of certain toxic substances regulations. This is a multi-substance risk management tool that prohibits the manufacture, the use, the sale, the offer for sale or import, or a combination of those activities of toxic substances under CEPA and products that contain them with some exemptions. So the regulations currently do prohibit the use, the sale, the offer for sale and import of 3 PFAS groups and products that contain them that have already been assessed in Canada, as I noted earlier, with some exemptions. So specifically PFAS, PFOA, and long-chain PFCAs. In 2022, we published draft regulations to remove or phase out most of these exemptions, and the final regulations are expected to be published this spring of 2025 and will come into force 6 months later. Next slide, please. So we also have taken action on PFAS, or we are taking action as well. I'm going to do the slides slightly out of order. I'm going to speak to the drinking water and biosolids points first. So Health Canada, because these are actions that have already been taken, Health Canada published a new objective for PFAS in drinking water this past August for specific PFAS detected in drinking water. And the Canadian Food Inspection Agency released their interim standard for PFAS as an indicator for all domestic and imported biosolids intended for use as commercial fertilizers. And that standard is now being enforced. In terms of actions that are underway, this includes a mandatory information gathering survey or notice under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So this is done under the Section 71 authority of CEPA, which was published this past July. We believe the results of this survey will provide better understanding of the use pattern of PFAS in Canada. The reporting period for the notice closes this coming January 29th of 2025. In terms of other actions, Environment and Climate Change Canada published a consultation document on the proposed addition of 131 individual PFAS for the National Pollutant Release Inventory. Proposing reporting would begin in 2026 for the 2025 year. So the comment period ended just this past November for that consultation, and final requirements are expected to be published early in 2025. Finally, you may know that Canada did lead the nomination and drafted the risk management evaluation and addendum for long-chain PFCAs under the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee, or POPROC, and we expect long-chain PFCAs will move forward for the potential listing to the Stockholm Convention at the upcoming Conference of the Parties, or COP, this coming spring. So I just wanted to note that this list is not exhaustive, and you can also refer to the revised risk management scope for additional federal action on PFAS in Canada. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the end of the Canadian presentation. We have noted some resources here. So this includes a link to the updated draft state of PFAS report, the revised risk management scope, and just general information on PFAS in Canada, where you can also link to the prohibition of certain toxic substances and the proposed revisions to those regulations as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both, Nabila and Nora, for that overview of the activities in Canada. So everything from the updated release of, the release of the updated draft State of the Science report and the associated risk management scope, to updated previous regulations and other actions on things like drinking water, biosolids, the equivalent of the Canadian PRTR, so the MPRI, and adding substances to that, and information disclosure aspects and others. And a final thank you to all of the speakers for sharing your knowledge on your activities, and also for being willing to answer several questions related to them.